We just buried him this morning, and now they're asking me to leave the house we built together. That was the first sentence that formed in Myrtle Delaney's mind as she sat at the head of the long oak dining table, the one Walter had sanded and varnished with his own hands in the fall of '94. The scent of his aftershave no longer lingered in the room, his chair beside her empty, not just in presence but in weight, in warmth, in everything. China was polished, the roast was overcooked, the silence between bites was louder than grief. Across from her, her daughter-in-law Romy placed her fork down with precision, her lipstick untouched, her voice smooth as glass. "We've talked," she said, folding her hands neatly. "It's time you consider something more manageable. This house. It's far too much for you now." Myrtle blinked. Once. Beside Romy Wade, her only child, her baby, who once begged her to sleep in his room during storms, gave a small deferential nod. No words. Just approval of the plan. A plan she hadn't been told about. The roast, the wine, the carefully set napkins all suddenly became part of a quiet ambush, a goodbye disguised as hospitality. Myrtle smiled out of habit more than anything else. A smile she'd used at funerals, at dentist appointments, at PTA meetings, when no one remembered her name. But inside, something shifted, like a picture frame knocked slightly off-center. If someone once made you feel replaceable in your own home, tell me where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story goes. Myrtle didn't sleep that night. She sat on the edge of the bed she and Walter had shared for over 3 decades, her fingers gently tracing the worn embroidery of the pillowcase. He favored faded blue thread, spelling out, "Good night, love." It was the kind of quiet habit you form after years of folding laundry for someone you know better than yourself. The house was still. Too still. The kind of stillness that used to feel comforting now felt like a countdown. Her mind replayed the dinner like a cruel loop. Romy's words hadn't just suggested moving out, they'd rebranded her as a guest in her own home. Wade hadn't defended her, hadn't offered a compromise. He'd nodded. That was all. She tried to make sense of it, but the math never worked. This was the same son she held through croup and chickenpox. The boy who scraped his knees learning to ride a bike up and down the driveway, Walter paved with borrowed tools. The man who once said, "I hope I find a wife who loves me like you love Dad." And now he couldn't even look her in the eye. Myrtle stood and walked through the house, slowly barefoot on hardwood. She and Walter had refinished together one Labor Day. Every doorway held a memory. The pantry still bore the pencil marks of Wade's height through the years. This wasn't just a house. It was a living archive of a marriage, of a motherhood, of a life carefully stacked and glued together with time. And now someone wanted to peel it apart like it was wallpaper from another era, something to be updated. Myrtle paused at the kitchen table, placed her palm flat on the wood, and whispered, "Not yet. Not like this." By morning, Myrtle had made her decision, not out of anger, not yet, but from the ache that comes when everything you thought was solid begins to shift beneath your feet. She dressed with quiet purpose, a pressed blouse slacks that still held a faint scent of lavender from last spring, and slipped into her flats like armor. Then she picked up her purse, the leather one Walter bought her for their 30th anniversary, and drove to the bank. First National sat on the corner of Maple and 3rd, just past the bakery that still carried Walter's favorite rye. For 30 years she'd waited in the car while he handled their finances. He said he didn't want her to worry about numbers. He wanted her to feel safe. But safety looks different when you're alone. Helen Marks, the bank manager, greeted her at the counter with a tight-lipped smile of condolence. "Myrtle, I was so sorry to hear about Walter. He was a true gentleman. Always asked about my grandson's baseball team." Myrtle nodded gently. "He thought the world of you, Helen, but I need your help now." She sat across from Helen's desk, her hands folded in her lap, like a student waiting for test results. "I don't know what we have or what I'm entitled to. Walter handled everything, but things are changing, and I need to know where I stand." Helen's expression softened. She turned to her computer and began typing. Click, click, scroll, pause. Her brow lifted. Well, Myrtle, it seems your husband was more prepared than most. And just like that, the first crack of light slipped through the walls of Grieve. Helen printed out the first page, then another, then 3 more. Each one slid across the desk like a quiet revelation. This is the joint account. It's modest, but enough to cover living costs for several months. And this here, this savings account, it's in both your names and significantly larger. Myrtle's eyes scanned the numbers. Her fingers trembled not from shock, but from the strange dissonance of realizing she wasn't as helpless as she'd feared. But Helen wasn't done. She tapped a key and tilted the screen slightly. Now this is where things get interesting. There it was. The Delaney Property Holdings Trust, opened 6 years ago. Sole beneficiary, Myrtle A. Delaney. Funded through recurring deposits from a business account under the name Delaney Renovations LLC. Myrtle stared at the name of the company. Walter's old side business. A few small projects, some kitchen remodels. At least that's what he'd told her. But the deposits weren't small. And they weren't random. They were regular, steady growing. Did Walter ever mention setting up a trust for you? Helen asked. Myrtle shook her head. He hadn't. But now that she thought about it, he had started double-checking mail deliveries, had begun writing things down in a locked notebook, had insisted she sign things just in case. He hadn't hidden it. He'd just never explained. Because maybe he knew deep down that someday she might need a fortress, not to protect his name, but to protect hers. That evening, Myrtle didn't turn on the lights. She sat in the darkened living room, lit only by the fading gold of dusk filtering through the curtains. Walter had insisted on keeping just sheer enough to let God in. Outside, she heard the familiar crunch of gravel, tires, a car door, voices, Wade and Romy. Again. They hadn't even waited a day. From the shadows of the stairwell, she heard them walk through the house, like surveyors, not sons or daughters-in-law, but people taking inventory. Footsteps in the hallway, muffled conversations behind closed doors. Then Romy's voice, bright and biting. The guest room can be a nursery, and if we knock down that wall, the kitchen opens up beautifully. Myrtle stood still, hands resting gently on the banister. She didn't interrupt, didn't ask what they were doing. She just listened. And then came Wade's voice, quieter. She's dragging her feet. We might need to push harder. Legally, she doesn't own anything. Does she? The final word settled like dust in a room full of sunlight. That night, Myrtle didn't cry. She went to the study, opened the fireproof box Walter had guarded like a vault, and began pulling out documents, title deeds, tax forms, trust certificates, signatures. Proof. Walter hadn't left her behind. He'd placed her in the center of a quiet plan, and now, while they were planning paint colors and knocking down her memories, she was quietly preparing something else. A line they wouldn't be able to cross. The next morning, Myrtle arrived at the office of Patel and Cumbo with a manila folder tucked neatly under her arm. It was still early. Dew clung to the front steps, and the building smelled faintly of coffee and photocopier toner. Inside, Mr. Dinesh Patel, the firm's senior accountant and Walter's longtime advisor, stood when he saw her. Mrs. Delaney. I didn't expect, I know. But I need clarity, Myrtle said softly. Not condolences. He gestured for her to sit. The chair creaked a little under her familiar warn, like the truth she'd come to hear. She handed him the folder. Helen at First National helped me. I need to know what Walter left behind. And I need to know what my son has already tried to take. Patel opened the documents, eyes scanning with practiced efficiency. He stopped mid-page, brow furrowing. You're the sole beneficiary of the Delaney Trust. Walter structured everything to fall outside of probate. The house, the business, even the cash reserves. He flipped a page and exhaled slowly. And, yes, your son has borrowed a substantial amount from the business over the past 5 years. Define substantial, Myrtle said, voice even. Roughly $87,000. Some under formal loan agreements, some less formal. Myrtle leaned back. Not surprised, Just confirmed. Walter hadn't been paranoid. He had been precise. Mr. Patel, she said, I need copies of every transaction, every loan, every signature. You intend to collect, I intend, she replied, to remind them who they're dealing with. Not vengeance, not spite. Just the quiet resolve of a woman who'd been underestimated one time too many. That afternoon, Wade showed up again. No warning. Just the sound of his car door slamming and the thud of his boots on the porch. Myrtle heard the jangle of his keys, he still had one, of course, and the soft click of the door swinging open like he belonged. He didn't call out. Instead, he walked through the house like a man inspecting property. She was already at the kitchen table sipping tea. Calm, composed, surrounded by a tidy stack of files and a yellow legal pad with notes in her careful script. We spoke to the realtor again. Wade began skipping pleasantries. He says spring's a good time to list. You'll want to be out before then. Myrtle didn't look up right away. She stirred her tea. Sugar. Clockwise. Deliberate. Then, you might want to hold off on those plans, she said gently. Why? She opened the top folder and slid it across the table. Because the house isn't part of your inheritance. It's held in a trust your father established 6 years ago. I'm the beneficiary. Legally, you have no claim. Wade blinked. Once. Then again. That's not possible. Myrtle reached for the next folder. And here's a breakdown of the $87,000 you've withdrawn from the company account over the past 5 years. Those were gifts. They were documented loans. With interest. The color drained from his face like someone pulled the power cord to his confidence. He looked at her, searching for the mother who used to bake cookies and stay quiet. She was still there, just no longer silent. The kitchen had never felt this small. Wade stood by the fridge, arms crossed, eyes darting between Myrtle and the folders spread neatly across the table. His confidence, once as casual as the way he used to raid that same fridge after baseball practice, was now brittle, cracking at the edges. Romy appeared a minute later, heels clicking like accusations on the hardwood floor. She stopped cold when she saw the documents. You're really doing this, she snapped. To your own son? Myrtle looked up slowly. No, I'm doing this for myself. Something I should have done a long time ago. You don't need all this. Romy pressed, gesturing wildly. You're one person. This house, the business. It's too much for you. Funny, Myrtle replied, folding a page and sliding it back into place. No one seemed concerned about what was too much for me when I was ironing shirts at midnight or refinancing our second mortgage to cover Wade's first failed venture. Romy turned to Wade. Say something. But Wade was quiet now, his voice caught in the realization that the person he thought would never challenge him just had. Dad never told me no Myrtle cut in, because he knew you'd assume it was yours. She stood slowly smoothing the creases from her blouse. This kitchen fed you. This house raised you. But none of that makes it yours. And then, after a pause long enough to carry every ounce of sorrow she'd ever swallowed, she added, You just assumed I wouldn't fight back. That was your mistake. Not mine. 3 days later, they came back with a lawyer. Not a local one. This man wore polished shoes and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He carried a leather briefcase that looked more expensive than Myrtle's entire wardrobe. She was already waiting in the living room, calm as morning fog. The sunlight slanted through the blinds just enough to cast lines across her lap, where a single folder rested on top of a closed book, Estate Trust Law 2nd edition. Wade walked in first posture, stiff, trying to look in control. Romy followed her voice, already sharpening. This is our formal notice. We're contesting the trust. Dad wouldn't have excluded his only child unless someone... Unless someone what? Myrtle asked quietly. Manipulated him, Romy hissed. He was ill, vulnerable. You took advantage. Myrtle lifted the folder and set it gently on the coffee table. He was neither ill nor confused when he signed these. He worked with a CPA, an estate attorney, and a notary. Every page is documented, every signature witnessed. The lawyer leaned forward. We'll argue undue influence, asset concealment, potential elder coercion. You're welcome to try, Myrtle said, folding her hands. But you should know, Walter made multiple copies, all stored with separate parties, including my attorney who's already filed a notice of defense. Wade finally spoke, his voice cracking. Why are you doing this? She looked at her son, really looked at him for the first time, not as a boy she raised, but as a man who'd mistaken love for access. Because you assumed I'd go quietly. She leaned back in the armchair Walter used to read in spine straight. You were wrong. The cottage sat on a quiet cliffside facing west. It wasn't grand. 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen. The floor creaked in places Walter would have already fixed. But it was hers. Entirely quietly, legally hers. Myrtle stood on the back deck, wrapped in her cardigan, the one with the missing button Walter never stopped teasing her about. In her hands was a quarterly report from Delaney Renovations, neatly printed, bound and delivered by Luis himself. You're operating in the black, the note read. We signed 2 new contracts this month. Payroll covered. Profits steady. No signs of slowdown. She ran her finger over the figures not to verify, but to feel them. To let the numbers speak what no one else had. You're capable. You're standing on your own. Inside the fireplace ticked as it cooled. A pot of chamomile steeped gently beside her reading chair. And on the counter, a letter from her lawyer lay unopened. She already knew what it said. The trust challenge had been dismissed. The judge found Walter's actions deliberate, independent, and thoroughly documented. Wade and Romy would have to repay every cent of the debt unless they wanted liens on their new home, their accounts, their future. But Myrtle didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She simply folded the report, placed it next to her tea, and looked out toward the horizon. The waves rolled in like slow applause, patient and unbothered. This wasn't a victory. It was a restoration, not of property, but of place, of voice, of self. The call came on a Tuesday just after lunch. Myrtle had just returned from the farmer's market, a bouquet of wild fennel tucked under one arm and a loaf of fresh sourdough under the other. She let the answering machine pick up old habit, but something in the voice made her pause. Mrs. Delaney. My name's Linda Morrison. I'm Margaret's daughter. My mother said you might be open to something. We're starting a support group, Women Navigating Financial Abuse Manipulation by Family Hidden Debt Legal Grey Areas. My mum says, you've lived it. Myrtle stood in the kitchen, phone still in hand, the hum of the refrigerator ticking behind her. The word support hung in the air not as pity, but as an invitation. She called back that evening. I'm not a speaker, she said. You are now, Linda replied gently. You survived. That's the credential. They scheduled her to speak the following month, nothing formal, just a room of folding chairs, lukewarm coffee, and women like her widowed by disrespect, or simply tired of being erased from decisions made in their name. Myrtle didn't plan a speech. She wrote nothing down. She only carried one sentence in her mind. You're not selfish for asking what's yours. That would be her opening line. Not for applause, not for drama, but because somewhere in that room, someone needed permission to stop apologizing for existing. And maybe, just maybe, that was the most generous thing she could give. That evening, Myrtle sat alone on the deck, wrapped in her husband's old cardigan, watching the sun dip beneath the edge of the Pacific like it was tucking itself in for the night. Her tea had gone cold beside her. She didn't mind. Beneath her bare feet, the wood of the deck was smooth, refinished by Luis and the crew as a quiet thank you gesture last month. Myrtle had insisted on paying. Luis had refused. You already paid, ma'am, he'd said. You saved a company and a man's dignity. A breeze lifted the hem of her sweater, and with it came the scent of salt pine and something she hadn't known she missed peace. Inside, her phone buzzed again. Wade. A short message. Final payment submitted. 6 years ahead of schedule. Thank you for the second chance. She didn't reply. Not out of malice, but because silence when chosen can be kinder than words. She turned back toward the ocean. The waves moved like memory, persistent, reshaping the shore, one quiet pull at a time. For the first time in her adult life, no one could take her house. No one could pull her name from a deed. No one could decide what she deserved. Myrtle didn't raise a glass, didn't whisper a toast. She just breathed in. Long, slow, full. Freedom didn't come in a courtroom. It came right here on a deck she owned under a sky that owed her nothing in a life that finally belonged to her.